or Sarah's Field Hospital. The fact that the emperor had surrendered his sword did not mean that the rest of the country had given up to the enemy. Military and civilian, they fought on with the ferocity of Frenchmen defending their patrie against the wave after wave of invaders advancing inexorably onto their precious soil. On September 4th, the Republic was proclaimed. In the capital, the imperial eagles and laurel-encircled N's were ripped from the Tuileries, and the tricolor again flew from the public buildings. Any rejoicing over the welcome change was short-lived as worse and worse news poured in from the front. Actually, there was no front. The lines of the army of France were broken everywhere. Its battalions scattered, the officers lacking all word of top command. Although there were a number of deserters, most companies put up a desperate but ever-retreating fight clear back to the fortifications of the city itself. There were countless instances of heroism, such as Marshal Conrobert's stand at Saint Privat, but the cause was hopeless. By September 19th, 160,000 Germans were encamped in the outer boys and immediate suburbs. The crack troops of the Crown Prince of Prussia posted to the north. The regiment of the Crown Prince of Saxony cutting off approaches from the south. In almost a complete circle, cannon bearing the ominous name of Krupp, K-R-U-P-P, were trained on the city. The siege of Paris had begun. During the initial weeks, except for more and more recruitment of a growing number of volunteers, life continued as usual, but people went about as though in a daydream. There was a sense of unreality, a complete inability to grasp the situation. It became the smart thing for intrepid citizens to drive out to the barricades for the sport of watching the batteries firing away at galloping Uhlans, U-H-L-A-N-S. The more cautious climbed to the summit of Montmartre to follow through opera glasses the sorties and skirmishes against the besiegers, which, at a distance, looked no more actual than battle scenes on a painted panorama. At first, it all seemed make-believe. A soldier's wife or girl frequently walked to the ramparts, with her man cheerfully carrying his gun, or came out during the afternoon with cheese and a liter of wine. Often as not, officers of the National Guard would leave their posts in care of their subalterns and go home for dinner. There were, to be sure, the wounded and the dead, but the wounded were cared for by pretty women in Red Cross uniforms, and the bereaved consoled themselves with the thought that their loved ones had died gloriously. Then the enemy demolished the bridges of St. Cloud and Sèvres. Every approach to and from the city was blocked, and the people jolted into a harsh awareness of their situation. It was a time of ignorance and alarm, of blind patriotism and hysterical suspicion. Anyone reporting an unsuccessful sortie or a defeat for the provincial armies was branded a traitor. The telegraph wires had been severed and all communication with the outside cut off. Gambetta, in October, had made an escape over the enemy lines in a balloon and was organizing a resistance and government of national defense in Tours, T-O-U-R-S. The males, reduced to a minimum, also went out and returned via balloon. That is when their pilots succeeded in dodging the volleys from German machine guns. Official dispatches between city authorities and Gambetta's forces were affected by carrier pigeon, and not always successfully. Many of the gentle creatures served as target practice for the Prussians. Others flooded back, blood-stained and injured. Not a few were snared for food. For by November, provisions were strictly rationed and the citizens were feeling their first hunger pangs. Earlier in Hubonez, Eauxbones, Eubones, Sarah Bernhardt had been in a frenzy of anxiety. At the news of the French army rout, she tossed to the winds all prospects of completing her cure and, against the orders of her doctors, rushed back to Paris. The siege, though imminent, had not yet begun, and she managed to send her small boy with his nurse, her mother, his sister, and grandmother, and the servants from the city, presumably to Havre. Havre. Then she settled in her apartment with only her cook and Madame Gerard to face what might come. Most theaters had shut down. What few struggled to remain open did little business, and none at all after cold weather set in. Let me try that again. What few struggled to remain open did little business, and none at all after cold weather set in. There was neither heat nor gas, and the only illumination came from petroleum lanterns, which sputtered and stank, or from candles substituting for footlights. The Odeon, along with the Française, being state-owned, had been officially closed. Then the latter was opened up as an emergency military hospital for casualties who, as time wore on, were becoming more and more numerous. Sarah made up her mind that if the First National Theatre could help care for wounded sons of France, so must the Odeon, and that she herself would organize and run the enterprise. She wrote to the prefect of police. Who at that time was a Count de Caretry, her former friend and possibly first lover. This is the letter. I hope that in remembrance of the little girl you once knew, you will listen to the young woman who, having known suffering, now wants to ease as much as possible the sufferings of others. I request in my name and in those of my companions a permit to install an emergency hospital with 32 beds in our foyer and lobbies. She got the permit. That was not the only thing she got out of de Caretry. Shortly after the opening of her hospital, she called to thank him for the permit and to ask for further favors in the way of government supplies. The weather was bitterly damp and chill, a precursor to the icy cold that was shortly to seize the city in a relentless grip. Caretry's office being unheated, he was keeping himself snug in a fur-lined overcoat. It was the finish of the interview. Sarah had his promise for food and medical supplies. She also had the overcoat. She wanted it, she said, for one of her ambulatory cases. A Breton mobile guard with a hand shot off, whose bed was needed for the more seriously wounded. A week or so later, with fresh casualties begging for admission and provisions running short, she called again on her friend the prefect. As she entered his office, the harassed gentleman was in the act of locking the door of a large wardrobe and pocketing the key. In a tone of pitiful pleading, he said, "My dear and beautiful friend, when you were last here, you appropriated my one adequate overcoat, with the result that I shortly came down with severe bronchitis. My only remaining outer covering is a battered old number which I have locked in that cupboard, and you can't get the key." This started the word of warning that went around town. Don't go near the Odeon in any warm clothes. Sarah Bernhardt will rip them off your back for her invalides. Caretry did, however, come through with an official order for 40 cases of biscuits, 1,000 jars of preserves, 100 bags of coffee, and 10 barrels of wine, most of which came out of the Empress Eugenie's larders in the Tuileries. Tuileries. I still haven't looked that up. Young Bernhardt paid numerous calls on influential acquaintances and acquired any amount of excellent loot. Oh, yeah. Her singleness of purpose, plus, when she chose to turn it on, that irresistible charm, had more persuasive potency than the point of a gun. Baron Rothschild saw that she was supplied with 2 hogsheads of brandy. The chocolate magnate, Monsieur Meunier, Meuinier, sent her 500 pounds of his nourishing product. The grocery czar, Felix Potin, contributed 100 boxes of sardines, and through the Dutch ambassador, she received bolts of Holland linen for bandages and 300 nightshirts. Due to her efforts, the Odeon Ambulance, as a French field hospital, was the best stocked in the city. This was during the earlier stages of the siege, when there were still provisions to be had, and Paris had not yet begun to starve. The 26-year-old actress took her complete management of her project. The 26-year-old actress took over complete management of her project. She also performed the duties of head nurse. She was quick to catch on to medical techniques, her instructor being Dr. Duchesne, Duchesne, an eminent physician whom Sarah, through some magic, had commandeered, and so won over he gave unstintingly of his time to attending her wounded men, leaving most of his fashionable clientele to the care of his assistants. A stove was installed outside one of the first tier boxes, and Sarah's personal cook kept making soup and tea all day long and frequently into the night. Her two steady workers were Mon Petite Dame and an older Odeon actress named Madame Lambquin, a loud-mouthed, somewhat coarse person, fond of calling a spade a dirty spade, but blessed with a heart of gold. There was one volunteer gentleman assistant who served as orderly, porter, and general factotum, and a military inspector who came daily to receive reports and, with the help of two stretcher bearers, performed the grim task of moving out the dead. Most men civilians were doing daily duty at the ramparts, but after dark, when the firing and sorties had let up for the night, business friends would stop in to help balance the ledgers. Sarah Bernhardt, the creature of fragile health, worked with the vigor of 10 peasants. Gerard and Lambquin ran her a close second. The three women rotated their sleeping hours, each taking every third night for what respite they could catch, while the other two stayed on duty. Sarah, with her extraordinary ability to fall asleep at will and a few minutes later wake completely refreshed, took occasional cat naps in her dressing room, usually flat on the floor. As often she moved out her couch to serve as an extra sickbed. Usually flat on the floor, as often she moved out her couch to serve as an extra sickbed. Oh, I see. Her endurance, her fortitude were phenomenal. She, who normally fainted at the sight of blood, staunchly held a basin, while Dr. Duchesne amputated a limb or probed in raw flesh to the length of his forceps for scraps of shrapnel. She, who abhorred unpleasant smells to the degree that she would dismiss anyone who smoked in her presence, with the exception of Gambetta, who was given occasional permission to light up his well-known cigar, now unflinchingly dressed wounds which reeked of infection and gangrene. She, who except during midsummer had abhorrence for outdoor air, spent an entire night along with detachment of Sisters of Charity and the brothers of the École Chrétienne out on the battlefield of the Chatillon Plateau, administering brandy to the dying, in a cold so bitter many only moderately disabled men froze to death. Winter had set in, the severest on record, with the thermometer below zero and the Seine choked with ice. Throughout the city, coal had run out. For some vestige of heat, the Odeon burned the wooden benches of the top gallery. Sarah and her workers ransacked the cellars and storage rooms for further fuel, and crates, platforms, throne chairs, balustrades, and old scenery flats were flung one by one into the furnace. Conditions throughout the city became daily more desperate. Disease was rampant. The cold took its toll of some, starvation of others. You know what? We're going to stop here. We'll pick up at winter had set in, the severest on record.